Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back in Newark, New Jersey. I used to be a homicide prosecutor in Newark, New Jersey 30 years ago. So, and it's relevant to the discussion today because I went from that role to working for the federal government. And I got involved in investigating international organized crime. And in the late 90s, we began bringing together data from satellites, from customs databases, the internet, to detect illegal trafficking across international borders. We prosecuted organized crime around the world, bringing together this data, the first generation of the internet. Landsat 7 went up, and there was all this data coming down. There was that literally clogging the receivers, but not much was being done with this data. So we found ways to use it to detect non-conforming shipments in international trade. Well, after September 11th, a lot of people were interested in this, to be able to detect illegal shipments of chemicals, nuclear materials, biological agents. And we got involved in doing security vulnerability assessments at critical infrastructure facilities. And we were using revolutionary things like GPS to monitor the movements in ports and things like that. And we were getting involved. We were asked to develop standards for security, international standards. And we developed, and even as we were doing those assessments after September 11th, it became clear that unless you had information security, you had no security at all. So we got involved in developing the international standards for security management systems and information security management systems. ISO 27000 is one of these standards that I'm going to talk about a little later. But in those days, it was kind of revolutionary to bring together that data. Now everyone has 10 times that power, 100 times in their phone. And the mapping and the technology that was used, and it was, the criminals were always 2 or 3 steps ahead of us in the use of cell phones, information systems. It was more difficult for the government to catch up and begin using those same technologies to be able to detect and prevent the criminal activity. So we talk about the future of cybersecurity. It's really, it's literally like the Mad magazine, Spy versus Spy, right? If those are old enough to remember that. The bad guys are always going to be the first to use technologies and exploit them. And now it's amazing what they do with analytics. If they profile you because of your ethnicity, your age, the sector you work in, they can pretty much guess your password. Or they have tools where they can pretty much guess your password. So you have to consider that when you're developing your strategy for password policy, things like that. So it's a remarkably quickly evolving field. At every measure out there, there's a countermeasure that you have to, but how can you keep up with this? So I want to walk around too, but do you have that little microphone, or? That's all right. I think I can see it from here. Now, this was the president of Cisco. There are 2 types of companies, those who have been hacked and those who don't know they have been hacked. The estimated economic loss of cybercrime is estimated to reach $3 trillion by 2020. And the partners continue to expand the supply chain of information. All the Department of Homeland Security. We have in New Jersey the CIC, the Center for Cybersecurity. There's all sorts of partners now when you're considering your cybersecurity posture. And why has why has this exploded? It's Internet of Things. If you look at the chart here, just 2012, you had 8.7 billion devices. As we continue to have devices that connect to the internet, our exposure grows exponentially. So every device that's connected to the internet presents a risk to the organization. So how do we manage that risk? 74% of the world's businesses expect to be hacked this year. Let's see, cybercrime is growing to $6 trillion by 2021. There's a 458% increase in search for IoT vulnerabilities. One of the interesting stories recently in the news, there was a secret military base in Africa that was detected because the soldiers were using Fitbits when they're walking around. So the people were able to detect the location of the base because they were able to access those Fitbits. So every new development comes with additional risk. Now, the worldwide cybersecurity market is projected to grow to $120 billion by 2021. And look at the evolution in the cybersecurity market. Look at all the firms, and this is just a snapshot of people that provide services related to cybersecurity. How, as a business, how do you make sense of it all? How do you select what is the right approach for you? And the WannaCry, remember the WannaCry last year? How many businesses here were impacted by the WannaCry in the U.S.? In the U.S., not many businesses were because we were up to date with patch management. But supply chain issues, UPS was impacted by that because there's a lot of legacy systems out there that are not up to date with their patch management. So that was largely in the US. We didn't have much impact from WannaCry, but it did shut down operations in Europe, England, particularly in the healthcare sector. Now, what constitutes cyber risk? There's risk against your IT and cyber infrastructure. That is people from the outside trying to hack in, which is happening all the time in increasingly sophisticated ways. I work in the, I am the CISO and general counsel for the command group companies. Our biggest clients are the health insurance. We manage millions of people's personal health records and financial records, process and print them. That's the #1 target for hackers. So every day it's we understand people are hacking to get in. Why is personal health information so desirable? Well, if you're the Chinese government, wouldn't you like to have the personal health records of, say, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, in addition to what you can do in collecting all of that information and use of it? So the major vulnerabilities, and then the risks resulting from your IT and cyber infrastructure. And this, with the Internet of Things, it expands the vulnerability by each device and each ability to access it. So the major people can be your greatest assets, but they can also be your greatest vulnerabilities. 80% of the risks that are bet your company risks come from inside the organization. There are increasingly sophisticated social engineering schemes out there. I'm an auditor for cybersecurity for ISO 27000. I audited a lot of the biggest law firms in the world a couple years ago. Every one of them had the same scheme. That is, someone would call from their London office, pretend to be their partner in London, and ask send files over. And every law firm had that same scheme or variations of it. So every organization is subject to that. So the people, everybody needs to be trained not just in awareness, but tested in their social engineering vulnerability, particularly in critical infrastructure firms or people that have access to a lot of information. Processes, you need to have in place processes, policies, procedures, information risk governance systems, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and technologies. We have the same technologies that are used against us can now be used to enhance your security posture, or at least assess and understand your vulnerabilities. There's organizations that can, just looking at your website, can scan you and detect every IP address that's connected to that domain and give you a scorecard of your organization in 30 minutes. So you and anybody else could do this too. So you might as well do that yourself to see where you stand, your vulnerability, because outsiders can do this on a regular basis to you. So there's all kinds of tools we can use now to defend ourselves, or at least assess and understand what our risks are. Now, cyber attacks are costly. We've seen in the news, and particularly when there's a violation of law involved, the way you handle a breach can expose your company to hundreds of millions of dollars of liability potentially. You can go out. One of my audit clients is Sony Pictures. I audited them after the incidents that were in the news from North Korea. Well, the CEO lost her job over the way that incident was handled. Similarly with Equifax, last year, the way that was communicated or not communicated gives rise to liability in the organization. So you have to have a protocol in place to communicate, to know about a breach, to communicate it in ways that are now required by law in terms of notification and disclosure. But unless you know this in advance and practice it, you're vulnerable. Unless you understand what the legal requirements are, you will compound your liability if you have a breach. So the classic metrics for a security management system is your ability to detect, prevent, or mitigate the consequences of a breach. Most organizations, it's 7 months before they realize they have a breach. So what does that tell you about now, someone knew about the breach, maybe in the IT department, or a contractor had evidence of a breach, but it was not communicated in a way to make a decision to prevent it and to notify customers. That can compound your liability by tens of millions of dollars. We have loss of business. When Yahoo was purchased by Verizon, in the middle of that deal, in a merger and acquisition context, they said, oh, by the way, we have breach affecting 1 billion people. But that didn't kill the deal. It just decreased the value by about a third, $300 million. Anthem was hacked. OPM was hacked. The Chinese have my background information and my fingerprints. In China, my records were hacked. I was notified by the government. And another CEO who lost her job, the director of OBM, had a brutal hearing in front of Congress. She didn't do the basic things that were required of doing a risk assessment and putting in place a mitigation plan and to communicate about the risk. So she lost another CEO who lost their job. And Equifax breach, the way that was communicated, gave rise to some insider trading prosecution too, because certain executives knew there was an issue and they began selling their stock before they notified the public about the breach. So that when you're on notice that there's a breach, the clock begins ticking. and the liability goes up. So you want to have processes in place to be able to understand the nature of a breach, and it can come in many different forms. It can even be a process error. So you have to have a comprehensive approach to understanding what your risks are, all of your assets, an inventory of all of your assets. I can tell you, using a tool from an outsider, get a snapshot of all of your IP assets. Do you have that? Do you have an inventory of every device that's connected to your network? Unless you have it, you can't possibly manage your risks, because the outside can gain access to that through your company website, an outsider. And we can, when we do an assessment of an organization, we start with that, an open source review, an assessment, a gap analysis to the requirements, legal requirements, and then before we do a comprehensive cybersecurity risk assessment. So the benefits of securing cyber, IP assuring compliance with, well, now it's a requirement to do business. If you want to do business in the healthcare sector with the big organizations, with big business, increasingly you have to be certified to the standards like ISO 27000, which incorporates compliance with laws like HIPAA, the New Jersey Data Protection Act, the New York State cybersecurity law. There's a new law effective last month from the European Union that you have to have privacy controls in place. Well, how do you keep up and understand all these emerging requirements? Well, what it requires you to do as an organization is sit down, do a risk assessment, understand what your critical assets are, what your critical business processes are, what are the interdependencies between your assets and your functionality, and what the risks are to that. And you can prioritize and quantify those risks. And one of the risks is non-compliance, and then develop a plan to implement controls that assure that you're in compliance with the standards. That's what standards like ISO 27 require you to do. And once you're certified, it gives assurance to your partners and your customers that you are complying with the cybersecurity requirements. Now, there's a number of emerging and existing cybersecurity related compliance requirements. We talked a little bit about the New Jersey Data Protection Law. If you manage personal health information, you have to have it encrypted in transit, encrypted at rest, and encrypted as it's backed up. And this protects you for example, a ransomware, it defeats that because they can go into your backups and get that. So there's a lot of requirements for encryption that have evolved over the years. So encryption is one of the great tools, but again, it's like spy versus spy. The encryption, there's attempts to defeat the encryption, and we get into areas of quantum computing and the differences. So you can never keep up, but you have to, on a regular basis, assess what your risks are and consider new technologies. Do a cost-benefit analysis to assure that you're complying with these laws. Now, increasingly in recent years, there's a realization that the responsibility for cybersecurity is really in the C-suite, the CEO, the board of directors, because this is compliance governance on the highest order. These are now bet-the-company risks, so it has to proceed from the CEO. And the only way that the organization can be protected is if you have policies and procedures communicated, that they're implemented, that they're enforced on a systematic basis. 90% of the breaches could have been avoided with the implementation of simple controls and security best practices. How do you define those best practices? Well, there's lots of standards. The New Jersey KIC has reference to them, but they all have this in common, and it's really a quality management system approach to cybersecurity. That is, you do a risk assessment, You design a security plan, you implement it, you audit and test its effectiveness, and then you get certified, and it's a cycle of continuous improvement. So it's done correctly. We're really talking about enterprise risk management, because today most of organizations, their most valuable assets are in the form of information, or they're housed in information. So if you're managing your information security risk, you are managing the risk to your organization overall. And these are the basic areas that you have to address in terms of protecting the asset management, the business, the risk assessment. You want to be able to identify the assets and your critical assets, your protect, access control, awareness and training, detect anomalies and events, and there's great artificial intelligence enabled tools now so you can detect an anomaly from any IP address within your network and respond. And then recovery. You want to be able to test your ability to recover and business continuity in case of a breach or a disruption. In this state, and I'll close with this because my time is up, Sandy was a big impact. And I had clients here that I had certified to ISO 27000, and every year they tested their ability to recover off-site in New Jersey. My clients in Manhattan. And so when Sandy hit, they were able to recover within 4 hours and continue to do business. Their competitors, some of them went out of business. They couldn't recover for weeks because they didn't have a plan to recover their assets. So now one of the requirements is to be able to recover your information systems and do business in a range of disaster scenarios. So that's it. I just note that these standards are accessible in the public record, and they're the framework for which assess and assure security that can give assurance that you're complying with best practices and protect an organization from liability. So, thank you.